So by this point, you're probably thinking, ugh, the Puritans, am I right? Like, they're so boring. You know, they just kind of like mucked it all up, right? But maybe you give them a little bit of a pass because they were trying to survive, because they were trying to build a population and conquer and reach their manifest destiny. Maybe you're thinking that, with if we became super practical and reproductive, sex like focused and oriented when it came to moving from being a nomadic social development, to a agrarian social development, then perhaps moving into industrial meant that we became even more pragmatic. And no, it's not true. Unfortunately, we just kind of went a bit backwards and doubled down on some contradicting beliefs, compared to the Puritans. And things may have gotten better, but they may not have also. It's really up to the reader or the listener to decide. So, one of the things that changes with the Industrial Revolution is that we become an industrial economy, which means there is another shift. And that shift not only impacts our economy and our goods and our services, but it impacts, you got it, sex, marriage, the family, gender, home, all of the above. So, with the Industrial Revolution and resulting industrial economy, one of the newest things was that we started working for wages rather than sustenance. So that means that the goods and services that were produced, commodified rather, um, than existing to be used directly by the family that produced them, right? Commodities, these are goods and services that can be bought and sold, were mainly bought and sold on the market using wages, right? And so we moved from being a society where the family and home were producing for their own sustenance, at least in part, to a system where, um, we're no longer using our own goods, but working for a wage so that we can buy those goods. Another thing that happened was that work and family were increasingly separated. And so that meant that those two spheres, the private sphere of the home and family, and the public sphere of the work and market, became increasingly separated and segregated and increasingly gendered. They'd already been gendered, but again, it intensifies as we move into industrial revolution and the industrial economies, because now all of the work is happening outside of the home, right? I mean, like, if you fast forward to today, only about 3% of our economy is focused on agriculture and sustenance, right? And most of us buy all of our goods, all of our services outside of our home. We don't, most of us don't provide much for ourselves, if anything. So, that separation, it hasn't really changed much, not in the United States at least. We continue to view the work and family as being separate spheres, and we continue to think that they shouldn't interfere with one another. Another change is that children started to become a burden rather than a blessing. Back on all those family farms, you needed lots of kids to work. And because death rates were so high for young people, people were constantly getting pregnant and reproducing, um, as well. And at this time, now that we're depending on wages, kids become a burden, they become expensive, and they are less likely to be, very helpful, especially once unions come in and restrict who can participate, in the workforce. So we see a big drop in fertility rates. Um, and that also comes with some other ideas about how fertility works. and also, the invention of contraceptives. At this point, we're really just looking at some rudimentary stuff like condoms and things like that. However, the logic of sexual restriction at this point now it becomes bothersome because, like, at least before people could have the excuse that they were having sex to reproduce. Now they don't even have that excuse anymore. So they just kind of abandon the whole idea, the whole logic of sexual restriction. And then the Romantic era emerges where, the Victorians in particular abandoned the idea of sex being strictly about procreation. And not only did they abandon this, but they took on some other hot takes that were unnecessary, like the idea that there is a gendered love sex binary, right? And in particular, that it meant that love was feminine and sex was masculine. And so you can see how this is the flip side of that Puritan value set. So obviously, the Victorians led everyone to sexual freedom. And here we are today enjoying our, you know, sexual democracy or whatever you want to call it. And wrong, psych, not true. But they did bring some other things that we all get to enjoy. What fun, right? Some of those things are that gendered love sex binary, where women are viewed as being more interested in love, and men are viewed as being more interested in sex, and how this has actually created a double standard for women and men, one that doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially if you're trying to claim that there is a binary when it comes to sex and gender. So, in particular, there's now this idea that women were uninterested in sexual pleasure. It made it inconceivable that women could feel the kind of sexual interest or passion that men might feel, not only for men, but that they wouldn't be able to feel that type of passion for women as well. And so, as you might imagine, there was a lot of same sex activity or same gender activity occurring between women that was basically, just going under the radar as being friendships or, um, like roommates and things like that, when really it was more likely to be lesbian or same gender sexual activity. Um, no matter how close women were or what they did together, no one imagined it to be sexual. And so that gave women a lot of freedom to explore sexuality with other women. Um, uh, Instead of with men who they were supposed to be pure and chaste, in relationship to, which actually was fed into or feeds into that good girl, bad girl dichotomy, right? That a good girl would be free of sexual thoughts, right? Um, but that men were dens of sexual depravity, that didn't make a lot of sense, because women were expected to be good girls, but also uh, in seeking men's pleasure to also be bad girls, kind of, but not really. Moreover, it was expected that sexual activity that was more for men's pleasure or to satisfy their urges was going to happen outside of the home, through the work of women or through sex work of women in particular. And definitely, this was not a career choice that was available. This was work that was viewed as being deemed or deemed as being only appropriate for poor women, women who had no other ways to support themselves. And so basically, you can see all that double standard in there where men were expected to be men and go out and basically have sex with anyone or anything that was available. And women were expected to not do that, to the extent where they could be involved in very obviously lesbian relationships and no one was the wiser.